I'm Rose Tanaka.
And I'm Brooke Logan, and we're going to hear you tell about your story in the Japanese internment camp. First question, can you please tell us about yourself before the events we will be speaking about? A brief history of your family, where you were born, what was your childhood like?
How long do you want me to talk about all that?
As long as you want.
All right. Well, I have to go back, I think, to my parents. My father came to this country as an immigrant in the year 1900. He was 15 years old at that time. And he came as a legal immigrant, but he came when the country of Japan, his native country of Japan, was going through a poverty-stricken area, and they also had overpopulation, and they felt that they had to find a place for some of their people. And they were trying to establish some kind of international recognition because they had been an isolated island nation. So anyhow, he came when in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, during a period of time when the United States was allowing for them to come. Before that, we had the other Asian immigrants, the Chinese, who came to help build the railroads and all that. But the people of Japanese ancestry came from an agrarian community country. And my father came and at age 15, couldn't speak the language, of course, and had to do whatever was necessary, but he managed to do fishing, laundry, and then finally settled on farming because that didn't require having to deal with people who couldn't understand what he was saying, and vice versa. So in 1912, my mother came over as a picture bride. And I don't know if you know about picture brides, but they exchange pictures. They have a go-between who introduces them through pictures, and then they look at the picture and say, oh, I guess I'll go ahead and marry her, or vice versa. And so my mother came from a family of number of girls, women, and they needed to be married off. So she had a sister who went to Hawaii and another sister who went to Brazil as brides. And so she came to the United States and married my father in, I think it was June or July of 1912, and got off the ship, passed the immigration requirements, and then they met and were married the next day. So that's the beginning of their life, if you can imagine. And then my father, as I said, settled down to farming, and they settled in California. Of course, he had done fishing, but he found a farm to lease. Keep in mind that at that time, there was considerable discrimination against the Japanese. They were not allowed to own property, so he had to lease the farm that he was working on, and this happened to be on the very coast of California, so close that when the weather was bad, I could hear the surf pounding on the beach that was about a block or a block and a half away from where we lived. It was a very nice place. Of course, we were extremely poverty-stricken and lived hand to mouth mostly, but California, if you have any experience in California, it's a very mild climate, and he could farm all year round. So if a crop failed, he just planted it over and harvested the next crop, and he could farm all year. He worked at that, and of course there were 5 children in the family. My oldest 2, I should say 6 at the beginning, because I had the 2 oldest brothers were sent back to Japan to help learn the culture. It was because my parents realized they were here to stay, but they wanted the culture to stay with them. So it's the obligation of the older children were to go back and get a bit of an education and bring it back to preserve it. So my oldest two brothers went to Japan to be with their grandparents, and one of them, unfortunately, the older one, was died in an accident on the farm, and so it left just the one brother who was there from about two years of age to about 16. He finished elementary school, and then he came to the United States. And for me, I was the youngest of the whole group, so to have this 16 or 17-year-old brother come was like a total stranger. He was more like an uncle to me, because I was just a toddler or tot at that time. And so that was my experience with my family. And so during the years up to the time that we entered the World War II, that was in 1941. I guess you're familiar with December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then the United States was able to declare that war existed between our country and the Axis powers. It was a very sudden event that shocked us. And we lived, as I said, I don't think I mentioned that we lived in a very small rural community. We were integrated even though my parents were aliens, we were American. All 5 of the children were American-born citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And we all started when we went to elementary school to learn English, and felt very American. And we were in a community of various cultural backgrounds: Italian, Portuguese, Hispanic, Swiss, any of those people. And so we were accepted because many of them were also of foreign origin and spoke their own language too. So they were very accepting of us, and we fit in. I felt very comfortable there. Of course, it was a very small community. There were 5 of us who graduated from the 8th grade, if you can imagine. Small school, 2-room schoolhouse for 8 grades. Well, then we went on to high school, consolidated high school, and there were a lot of people there. 80 in the whole 4 years of high school, 20 in my class, sophomore class. Well, I was a sophomore when the war started, when the attack occurred, and that was when the war started. Do you want me to stop now and go on to the next
Well,
question?
can you describe that day? What did you do? How did you feel? What do you remember thinking on the attack of Pearl
Well,
Harbor?
I remember that I was at church. It was a Sunday, and a very kind woman up the road from where we lived had decided that I needed to be saved, I guess, and she took me to a Presbyterian church, got permission from my parents to take me to a Sunday school, and so I was but when the war started, I was 15, but when she started taking me to church school, I was about 12 or 13. We had been going to the Sunday services and Wednesday services. Well, and Sunday service that day was pretty normal because it was Sunday morning. And although we had always had a few of the military fellows come, there was a camp, San Luis Obispo, a military camp, and some of their soldiers used to come in and attend the services. By evening, and you must keep in mind that we did not have television, didn't have modern radios except for my older brother who had fixed up a radio. But when we went to the evening service, everybody was in, well, they were stunned because they said we had been attacked, because by that time the news had come out that the Hawaiian Islands had been attacked. And so everybody, me included, was very upset. Absolutely no soldiers appeared at our service because they were confined to the camp. military camp. And from there on, I was shocked by the attitude of the press, the radio, and it was very important at that time for the government to build up patriotism on the part of everybody, because they were building up their armed forces. Now, one older brother who had turned 21 that year was already drafted and in the military, because the draft system had gone in even before, because there was the World War II had already started in the European front, and the United States had sided with the Allies and were giving them military goods, ships and armaments and all that, and then also were looking forward to the time that they might get involved in this war. And I have to say, I found out later, and keep in mind that President Roosevelt at that time was the very savior of this country, because he started all the programs that helped this country out of a depression. And he was very much admired. But then I learned later that he harbored a very much a feeling of discrimination, of hatred against the Japanese. And he did not, he wanted to go to war with Japan, because Japan was already at that time invading countries in the southeastern part of the world, because of their small size and wanting to have more space, and had become part of the Axis powers. So it was Germany, Italy, and Japan who were the Axis powers, and the Allies were the British, French, and the United States decided to help the Allies. So the world was split into two factions that were fighting, and that's why it was called World War II, because it spread out to the Asian part of the world too, as well as Europe. You probably don't want to lecture on history. You have knowledge of all this, but all of a sudden, what I wanted to say is how I felt was that all of a sudden everybody looked at us as enemies, and Roosevelt said, Roosevelt's feeling about us was that we had enemy blood in us, and it didn't matter that we were born in the United States. We were through our blood, were incapable of being American, true Americans. And he said we were unassimilable. I had to work on the pronunciation of that word. But anyhow, on the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, you have to remember that all the immigrants who came there came as were impoverished people. They didn't have the means to go inland, so they just settled in places like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And so there were large numbers of the Japanese population along the coast of California. The census of 1940, I believe, said that there were maybe 126,000 people of Japanese and Japanese descent living in the United States at that time. I'd say about at least 120,000 of them were living on the west coast, along the water, along the Pacific coast. So that you can imagine that it was a large concentration, and the larger concentration of people were in those cities. Many people doing, well, they did work, they had businesses, they had shops, they had concentrations of people in those areas, and many of them spoke, of course, their own language. So there I was.
Will you describe your experience as you transitioned from life as a citizen to life as a prisoner?
Well, that was a very unreal situation. Do you want to hear about how I went to the camp, that particular camp that I went to?
Whatever you want to say.
That in itself is a little bit of a story. There were two military areas in in California that I know, Military Area 1 and Military Area 2. Military Area 1 was along a strip along the seacoast because they thought that the Japanese and Japanese-blooded people would be communicating with the Navy. For some strange reason, the United States thought that the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army was going to come all the way across the ocean and invade the West Coast, which was, you know, totally foolish at this point. But anyhow, they felt that the Navy, if they could get to Hawaii, which was still thousands of miles away, then they could come to the West Coast. There were incidents that submarines came and tried to hit the ships that were in the bays along the coast, but they were not successful. These are suicide missions as far as they were concerned. They were military submarines, two-man submarines, the size of a bathtub, if you can imagine, and they had torpedoes, and they would go and torpedo an oil tanker or something like that. But that was what, and of course they would, you know, lose their own lives in the process. But that was what they were trained to do. So because of these little incidents, they decided that we had Japanese blood in us were untrustworthy. If we looked like the enemy, we were the enemy. And so whether it was the radio or the newspapers, they just didn't distinguish between us and the real enemy, which was in Japan, which were in Japan. Well, you can imagine, think, my father was in this country for 40 years. He spent the majority of his life in this country and had lived here and felt like he was an American. He was not allowed to become an American citizen. He was, they had a law on the books that said that Japanese, and they targeted the Japanese people in particular, and said were ineligible for naturalization. And so California had an alien land law that said if you're not eligible for naturalization, you are also unable to own property, and that's why he leased the property. I think I already mentioned that. But this was the kind of discrimination, and there were pictures and posters that went up, and you see these big billboards, and they would have discriminatory ads on there, and they had some of the shops, I understand, and that didn't happen in my community because I said we were accepted. But in the cities, there were signs that said Japs not wanted. They didn't want anybody to come into, they wouldn't serve them. And you've probably heard about what happened in the South with the African Americans. It was a very similar thing. They wouldn't do any business with people who came in there. They didn't want their business. So, but I missed all of that. But I think what I started to say was, how did I get to Manzanar, this camp in California? My father was helped by a very kind friend who lived next door. He was a newcomer to our community, and he was the only person who stepped forward and really did something. He said, the Executive Order 9066 that was issued on February 19th of 1942 said, or put into motion, what happened to evacuate the 120-some thousand people from the West Coast who had Japanese ancestry. And he was a military, the man who helped us was a military retiree. He had been a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He had been a captain in the Merchant Marine. We all called him Captain Williams. We didn't say Frank. We weren't on that kind of terms. We respected him, and he was, but he was a remarkable person because he had held a very good position in the military. But he built himself a house with his own two hands. And when the order came out and they said, all right, you have about a week or 2 weeks notice, within a week or 2 weeks notice, we were to evacuate on our own if we were able to and go inland. Well, many of us, or most of us I should say, did not have the financial means. Everybody lived very frugally and didn't have the savings and all that. So most people were not able to move in. Some people were able to pile things on their car and drive inland. My father said, well, I think we'll go to a military area. He didn't call it military area 2, but that was actually where it was located, in the middle of California. The strip that was the eastern strip of California was area number 2. Just in case, they said, the war did not go well, then all of it was going to be under orders to be evacuated. But the first most important part to be evacuated was the military area 1 along the coast. And so my father moved inland, but Captain Williams said to me, look, you're in school, you're a sophomore, you have to finish your school year. So I'll write a letter to General DeWitt. He was that kind of a man. I'll write a letter to the general and tell him that I'll be responsible for you and you can finish your school year out and then go in and join your family. Well, of course, within a week, the letter was returned saying there would be no exceptions. So I did stay with him for about a week or 2. The other thing he did, my father had to abandon a crop of lettuce that was in the field there, and Captain Williams went down and he himself harvested the crop of lettuce. He probably hired somebody to help him, loaded all the produce on the lettuce on this truck and drove it 200 miles south to Los Angeles to the vegetable market and sold it, because the whole crop would have just rotted had he not done that. And he took the money that he got and he drove into Reedley, where my father was living, and put the money in his hand and said, here's your money for your crop of lettuce, which would have been gone. My father couldn't believe it. The third thing that happened was the FBI had already targeted a lot of adult males, heads of households, and decided to put them in enemy alien prison camps. And my father was picked up and taken to a prison camp. And this was not an evacuation or a relocation center or an internment center. It was a prison camp for enemy aliens. And they took hundreds of these heads of households to the centers, and then were going to keep them for the duration, however long it took. Most people did not understand that we have constitutional rights not to be held without charges. And so, but my father was being held. Captain Williams understood all that. He said, they can't do that. So he put on his full dress military uniform and went up to the camp where my father was being held, which was up north, south of San Francisco. And he went to the camp and he said, look, I'm Captain Williams and I'm here for a hearing. You're holding Mr. Hanawa, which was my father's name, and I want to know what the charges are. So the people were very surprised to see this official-looking man come, and so they said, okay, we'll have a hearing. So they had a hearing, and to me, it tells me that this was probably true of most of the other men who were held there, that they asked him a few questions. They had no real reason to hold him. I mean, it's not like he owned guns or did some kind of illegal activity or anything like that. And by the time the hearing was over, they said, well, I guess we can't make any charges. He will be released on condition, and that was important, on condition that the family is in an internment camp. And of course, we weren't at that time. The area we had moved to we knew was coming under orders, and they would be moved also. So my mother she got very upset, and she said, well, we have to have him released to us, and he can't come out as long as we're not in a camp. So she made arrangements for us to go into Manzanar, because she knew of some people who were already down there and appealed to them. So my brothers, my two brothers were there, and my sister, my mother and I went down to the camp. The rest of the people who had lived in that same community were then sent to assembly centers and then to Poston to another camp. So we kind of separated ourselves out because we wanted to be reunited with my father. And so when we got to Manzanar, they found a place. The camp was pretty full at that time, of course, but they did find one room for the 6 of us, and true to their word, the government released my father, and he was reunited with the family in Manzanar. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was an interesting transition, and I want to explain why we didn't go down to Poston. All the rest of the people had to go either to assembly centers or to other camps, because the months after the evacuation started, you have to think in terms of over 100,000 people who would be held in these internment camps. They didn't have those camps built up. So there was one up in Tule Lake, Northern California, and Manzanar were the first ones. And so they had to hastily build camps for over 100,000 people, and that took a little doing. So many of the people had to stay in racetracks, state property where they had state fairs, county fair grounds, and that sort of thing. They threw up buildings in a hurry and barracks and put them in there to await the completion of those other camps. And so and then by the end of the year, they had all the camps they needed constructed, and they were all like on very unwanted property. Manzanar was on a desert, it was desert. Others were in very isolated areas. And so it was 10,000 people at our camp on 1 square mile. 36 blocks of barracks, army-type barracks. And we were not used to winter snow or summer desert heat, and that was the transition to living. So, any other questions?
Yeah. Were you ever asked to fill out the loyalty questionnaire, and could you describe that experience?
Okay. Anybody who was over 17 was subject to responding to the questionnaire. This came about because the government had to decide what to do with some of the older generation. The older generation being, and I'll tell you, the word Issei. My parents were Issei, and my generation is Nisei. The Japanese words for number 1 and number 2 is Ichi, Ni, San, number 2 and 3. So Issei comes from the word 1, Ichi. And Nisei comes from the word number 2, Nisei. So my generation is the second generation. Theirs was called the first generation. So the Isseis were not eligible for citizenship. The government thought maybe they should start sending them back to Japan. And the other thing was they wanted to determine whether they were loyal or not. And of course there was a large discussion, and people got thrown into camps all of a sudden, lost all their property, businesses, professions, everything, and were confined in a very small area. There were probably there were 6 of us, and I don't know if you can see 20 by 25 feet. That was the room that our family of 6 were confined. And couldn't get there with anything except what we carried. So it was a pretty difficult situation, and this made people of different views about the evacuation. Of course, we were all told, our philosophy that came with our Issei parents were 2. One was, it can't be helped. This is what happens. It can't be helped. We are powerless. So, shikata ga nai comes from the word shikata, it can't be helped. And the other was gaman. Gaman means persevere, put up with it. So those are the 2 philosophies or thoughts that made it possible for us to put up with this. Okay, but that also caused, not everybody was totally agreeable to that. They said, yes, but we're American citizens, what are we doing here, imprisoned? And then there were people, of course, who wanted to get out of there. Some of the Isseis are the ones that said, well, if they're not going to let us be Americans, maybe we should go back to Japan if the government will send us. Well, most of the people had families, children. My parents weren't going to go back and abandon us. So they, of course, would not go back. But the government decided, since the war was not at that point going very well, American prisoners were being held in Japan. If the Americans wanted these prisoners to come back from Japan and be released, they needed people of Japanese ancestry to be used as exchange prisoners. So we were, in a sense, potential exchange prisoners. And so they asked everyone who was over the age of 17 to respond to these questions. Number 1, do I have allegiance? It's not exactly words, but I'm not. I will give up my allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And number 2, the second one was, I will fight to protect the United States. And if you answered no, the first one actually had to do with allegiance to America, and would you go back to Japan? So if you answered no, that means that no, I'll give up my allegiance to America and we'll go back to Japan. That's for the older generation. It was an insult to ask an American citizen that, you see, because they're assuming you have allegiance to a foreign country. So if you said, no, I will give up I'm not an American, I will go back to Japan. That was a no. And then the second question is, yes or no, I will serve my country in a military situation. So, being a female, I didn't have to worry about that. So of course the answer was yes, I am an American. Number 2, I will work to protect this country. If you said no, then you were not an American. You were subject to being returned to Japan. Well, I don't know if I'm making myself understood here, but if you were a no-no person, that means you were not an American, you were had allegiance to Japan. So the question was, how many of us were going to answer yes and how many were going to answer no. There was no, if you were under the age of 17, by the way, you had to go with your parents wherever they went. And I was the youngest and I was already 17, so I made up my own mind, and so did the rest of the family. Even though we were in the camps and there were some very high feelings about how they were being treated, the United States government did not get enough people who would say, no, I'm not an American, I want to go back to Japan. A few did, and they're very difficult stories in connection with that because of what they did to the children who were taken back there. And they went up to Tule Lake and then were used to, and some of them had to actually be sent to Japan. So that was the loyalty questions that you were asking about. And of course there were some young men who were saying, yes, and I want to fight in the American Army, U.S. Army. And so that's another question.
When and why did the internment program come to an end?
The internment program came to an end late in 1945. By then, all the people who had been in camps at that point, the government had these 10 camps with over 100,000 people in the camps, and it was getting to be a problem for them. So, and by then, the U.S. was winning the war. In 1945, if you remember, that was the end when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and then the war ended in August of that year. What was your question again? I lost my train of thought.
When and why did the internment program come to an end?
All right. Yeah, when the government realized that the war was going to end successfully with the United States, and they had on their hands all these people imprisoned. And even before that time, they realized that they would have to release some of us if we had a place to go. One of my brothers got out because he could come out to Colorado, for instance, and he was a diesel mechanic, and he started a shop out here. My sister came out to continue with her nursing education, and if you had a place to go, you were allowed to leave. So everybody, of course, wanted to leave and were able to find a way to go. As I said, I left in 1944 in June because the week that I graduated, I was told that through the kindness of strangers, I was going to come out to Colorado to attend the University of Denver. And it was a total surprise to me. I hadn't applied anywhere. There was no money, but there was a national organization to help. They knew these students were graduating from high school in the camps and needed some kind of assistance. So my first year was arranged by this Japanese American Student Relocation Council, and they made it possible for many of us to leave and attend a university. So that's why I'm here.
How did other citizens treat you after your release?
How did other people, after I was out of the camp? Well, I came to Denver, and of course the place I went was the college campus, the university campus here. I came out in the summer. So when I went to it was a whole new world to me, of course. I felt there was some discrimination, but young people were pretty much accepting, and they were not discriminating. I was placed in a home where I was the nanny and a housemaid for someone, and that gave me room and board, free room and board, because I didn't have any money. The council made it possible to pay my first year's tuition. My parents had a few dollars that they gave me so I could buy books and things, but essentially my first year was taken care of financially, and most of my time was spent on campus, and I know that there were people who were in the neighborhood who looked at me suspiciously. They weren't sure that I was the right person to take care of any children or do work or live around in the neighborhood. But I didn't have any problem with that. On campus, of course, I was not included in any of the social activities. There were clubs and that kind of things, which was fine for me. But I was aware that, you know, people looked at me like there was something wrong.
How did this treatment change as the years passed after the end of the war? Did it?
After what?
How did this treatment change as the years passed after the wars ended, or did it?
Okay, yes, it gradually got better. Colorado was fortunate enough to have a governor who was welcoming. Governor Ralph Carr was the only one of the Western governors who said that we had a right to go on with our lives here and relocate in the state. There was some discrimination, but I think people got over it. After all, the U.S. won the war, Japan lost the war, and things are okay. I think if things were different, I think that there would have been a lot more discrimination, but the United States was becoming more understanding of what happened to people of color, and of course, the years that passed, we, and I mean my family and I, were aware of what happened to other ethnic groups, especially the African Americans, and also the Native Americans. And then we noticed this with the Hispanic people also, that this country, for some reason, was settled by the white European people to begin with, and it's been hundreds of years, but it's still feelings of superiority, inferiority, and they tied it to skin color and national origins. So I think it's been something that I have spent my adult years working on, social justice, as I call it, to make sure that this does not happen to people of color. And so even at this point in my life, if people ask me to speak about it, I will talk about it. So I will answer as many questions as necessary. And but I do feel that, and I tried to transfer this feeling, and I think successfully, to my own children, to work for social justice. I have a daughter who went on the march to Washington, D.C. in her college years with Martin Luther King, and my another son who tries to help the Cesar Chavez movement in California, the farm workers in California who were discriminated against. And so I think that it's been sort of a lifelong desire to see that discrimination does not affect the minorities.
Last and final question.
Okay.
If there is one or several lessons that you wish for others to learn from your experience, what would it or they be? What would it be?
Well, I think it's important for everybody to understand, going back to what's in our Constitution, that all people are created equal. That there has to be justice for everybody. And if you are going to treat people differently, then you are not following the main part of the founding of this country. And it sounds, it may sound like I'm talking above things, but actually I have seen the improvement over the years, and I have seen also that it takes the American public being involved in government. And if we have a democracy, then it means everyone has to do their part. And you have to work out the differences. But I think the one thing I have gained is, at my age, is that healing has taken place. It's still not all fixed, because you still see that there are people who are discriminated against. You have something like wartime events in other countries around the world, and all of a sudden the people who come from those countries are looked upon as perhaps they should not be part of this country, or should not be treated equally. And so I think that I'm pleased that healing takes place, but it takes much patience. It takes much effort on the part of everybody to try to help and participate in government. A lot of people say, well, it's none of my business, you know, it's just, we have a representative government. The government is going to do this, but I think that the government or the representatives are elected, and if they are to be elected, it takes a knowledgeable population to tell them and express themselves, whether it's to go up the state capitol steps and say, hey, look, this isn't right, we need to fix this, or to send letters or whatever. I've been a member of the League of Women Voters, and that is mainly that voters are the people who decide on the government, and it's up to the voters to let the government know and to influence them. Some people get up and have ability to lead, and so they get up and they run for election. And so this is a participatory country, and it means even down to the voter who goes into the voting booth and pulls a lever and expresses it's very important. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you, Rose.
Yeah. You know, if you don't mind,
You're
would you
welcome.
mind if I asked you one more question?
You have any more questions?
I just have one, actually.
All right.
Do you think there are any parallels between your experience and the experience of Muslim Americans today after 9/11?
Oh, yes, I think that there is, because all of a sudden the suspicion of people from Muslim Americans or Muslims, or people who appear to be Muslims, I mean, whether it's women who wear scarves. I remember very much the time when we had 9/11 occur and the Twin Towers in New York were knocked down. Do you remember? Well, you wouldn't remember, it was before your time, but there's a mosque out here and on Parker Road. And when that happened, at that time, there were Muslim women who were wearing their headscarves who would go shopping, and they were treated badly by people who didn't want anything to do with them and were very rude to them. And so, in fact, we're about to attack them, and probably were some attacks, and the appeal went out for people to escort them. People went and helped the women, accompanied women to do their shopping or things outside. The other thing that happened that really impressed me was many people of faith. There are different churches. People went out to the mosque and they wanted to prove to the people at the mosque that the rest of the country did not all have ill feelings about them. They made 2 circles around, they all held hands, and can you imagine? It was just so heartwarming to think 2 rows of people, there were enough people to make 2 rings around the mosque, and they held their hands and said, we are with you, we want you to feel secure. And then, of course, because of that incident, the security went in on the airports. You know how it is. I know that my I know that people were pulled out of line if they looked foreign and were treated with, really checked out to make sure that, you still can't go through an airport without going through security, but all of that started up as a result of that. So maybe it's good, because there are some people among the population, or that there are some people who do have bad feelings, and there are criminals and that kind of thing. But I never saw so much of a change in security, which occurred after that event. So I think that no matter how, we cannot relax and say everything's okay now, everybody accepts each other, because anytime you have any kind of a thing happening like that, you have to make sure that people are protected from that kind of thing.